Ilana Mercer originally hails from South Africa, but she lives here in Seattle now and has lived here in the United States for many, many years, and has actually been writing a column weekly for 20 years on paleo-libertarianism, which is a huge achievement. If anyone in the room has written professionally for a living, you know how daunting that can be. She has a couple of main books to her credit. One of them is called Into the Cannibal's Pot, which is a cautionary tale for America, and more recently, a book about the Trump Revolution. To her great credit, some of the various agencies that syndicated her were not happy with her opposition to the Iraq War in 2001 and 2002, but an opposition which she bravely retained. And again, anyone who's written for a living understands what that means when you stick to your beliefs or your principles over simply selling more books or more writing success. She writes for outlets like Town Hall and WorldNet Daily. So please give a big round of applause and warm welcome to Ilana Mercer.
I've prepared a wide-ranging observations about democracy, or rather about democracy as idiocracy. My own, of course, some from Hans Hoppe, on whose shoulders we all stand when it comes to democracy, the founding fathers, and the ancients, the Athenian philosophers. The fun part of speaking about the dumbing down inherent in democracy is that I get to pair the word democracy with idiotic, idiocracy, and plain dumb. Thankfully, this crowd will not be reaching for the smelling salts, and I'm sure you won't be asking for safe spaces. Our democracy is a bit of an idiocracy, wouldn't you say so? Using the film Idiocracy, I hope some of you have watched it, probably dates me, using it as an idiom. It's old, and it's a satire, a form of commentary unpopular these days because incomprehensible and offensive to snowflakes young and old. And in our infantile, childish democracy, you apologize for references that date you. The film, a product of Mike Judge's genius, as is Beavis and Butthead, of course, is about the dumbass dystopia that America will become in 500 years. However, look around you, that dystopia is upon us. When you see the broken down, lawless, thuggish, excellence-hating, unhappy place America is fast becoming, you realize that the film Idiocracy is more documentary than satirical distraction. Our cultural institutions are dominated by robust, boorish bullies whose comparative advantage is in their aggressive ability to silence and excommunicate us and tell us how to live. And I hope I have a time for some anecdotes. And I think Exhibit A here is Hans Hoppe. I think some of us remember in 2005 when he was practically expunged from the university in which he taught. Of course, he was exonerated by the thought police. He simply brought down to earth the concept of time preference for his students and suggested that gays might have different time preference rates. And this was an absolute outrage and an outcry, and Hans obviously didn't feel too much of an affinity for the country afterwards. And much like Voltaire's hero, Candide, who ended up in Turkey, so did Hans, and that's to our loss. In any case, take the schools. Thomas Jefferson insisted that children, even the simple ones, and yes, you could say simple ones in those days, must know reading, writing, common arithmetic, and history. He said nothing about social science, social justice, and self-esteem, the non-analytical stock in trade of schools, primary, secondary, and tertiary. The media, when they're not faking the news, convey emotionalism. Religious institutions junk doctrine for pop theology and feel-goodism. And what goes for compassion is really sappy sentimentality, which invariably leads to misplaced compassion. Youth, as I mentioned, is deified and adults are diminished. And not even a political Samson like Donald Trump has managed to deep six the deep state. We live in a cult of the self or the selfie. Sustaining a thinking culture when the cult of the self is so central to our society becomes difficult. This is because solipsism, the individual placing himself at the center of the universe, doesn't lend itself to a contemplative existence or to civility and consideration towards others. True, we don't yet irrigate our crops with Gatorade, like in the Idiocracy, or have garbage avalanches, as in the Idiocracy, but many of our once great cities, including this Seattle, are now lawless, buried under mounds of human waste generated by humanity living on the streets. President Camacho, has anyone watched Idiocracy? It's brilliant. Yay. President Camacho of the Idiocracy was an ex-porn star. And the current occupant of the White House, whom I supported, associated with porn stars, on and on. Deplorables, and I am one, all too often act like ditto heads, refusing to hold the leader accountable. Right and left, there is no defying the man and the powers that be once in power. Left or right, Americans line up all too obediently and foolishly behind their party's respective king. Is our citizenry really that different from the ungrammatical, grunting, rutting characters of the Idiocracy in all their violent, uninhibited, sexually obscene, consumerism-addled existence? Look, proving empirically that democracy causes the Idiocracy is beyond my ken. Even proving a solid correlation is ambitious. But as proponents of the Austrian school's analytical method, we feel it in our praxeological bones, as Mises would say. We probably cannot test or falsify a hypothesis about the dumbing properties of democracy, but we look around us. We survey history and its sages. We reason and we deduce that the littered political and cultural landscape is linked with tenets of our American democracy. And these, crudely distilled, are as follows: unlimited and indiscriminate access to power, contingent on money, of course, as Bob mentioned. Unlimited and indiscriminate access to the ballot. Unlimited and indiscriminate access to stuff. By extension, unlimited and indiscriminate jurisdiction by the state and its special interests to exercise power and extract and dispense stuff. Institutions, state and civil society, whose gatekeepers select and seek out consensus-seeking, state-pleasing mediocrity. And finally, a monetary mindset that keeps the masses busy with bread and circuses. In other words, pleasure and frivolity as Rome burns. That's American democracy. Those are the building blocks, the cornerstones of our democratic idiocracy. Self-rule, as my colleagues have pointed out, is an illusion. The individual in democracy has little say in the way he is governed. Democratic capitalism, on the other hand, is glorious. It gives us enormous, truly diverse, magnificent choice in what we consume. The common choices when it comes to cultural products are not entirely encouraging. But hey, I can buy the best of Bach, and the rest can slum it with Cardi B. Again, unlimited, indiscriminate, and unqualified. These are the words that inform the American democracy. In particular, our degenerate democracy doesn't tolerate difference, unless in appearance or in genitalia. And it doesn't like to differentiate. In the American democracy, to differentiate, discriminate, prejudge at your peril. At the same time, not to do those things, not to differentiate, discriminate, and prejudge, is dumb and can even get you killed. For example, people ought to make discriminating decisions in their daily lives based on probabilities and generalities. That you choose not to live in a particularly crime-riddled county or country in no way implies you're racist or that you consider all residents there to be criminals, only that you've made a sensible determination based on statistically significant data as to where you invest your scarce and precious resources, namely your life and your property. The very essence of smart willing is the willingness to differentiate, discriminate, and prejudge all words that make our political overlords give chase. Indeed, the abiding creed of almost every institution of our society is against discriminating, discerning, applying judgment, prejudging, and especially against separating intellectual and the cultural from the political. By this I mean the tragic raping, as my colleague here pointed out, of every facet of life, art, music, literature, sport, and work, with a racism construct artificially invented in academia. Democracy dreads differentiation, and it's about leveling everything out into sameness. When you consider what informs our democracy, it's analytically obvious that it would beget stupidity. Unlimited and unqualified access, unlimited and endless excess, macro and micro, enough central power to enable the orgy, not least by a monetary policy. By popular demand, democracy's creed quickly descends into a cacophonous creed without absolute standards. Democracy and its twin evil, multiculturalism and tribalism institutionalized, is premised on there being multiple, rival, and competing truths and as many standards. And all are equal. Bach is no better than Beyoncé. Books like The Color Purple are on par with the literary canon, namely Shakespeare or William Faulkner, the great Southern writer. And the deeply silly Ta-Nehisi Coates, anyone knows him, a racial agitator, very silly man, is as good as Thomas Sowell, Walter E. Block, and our Walter E. Williams, and our Walter Block, who's fabulous, and certainly better than any one of us. Now, how stupid is mankind? The greatest thinkers before Hoppe, the ancient Athenian philosophers, they detested democracy. Yet 2,000 years on, we are still rabbiting on about our democracy and the need to save it from them Russians. Certainly among the ancients who matter, there was a keen contempt for mob-led, passion-ridden democracy. In Athens, there rose a minority party. I Googled it, I couldn't even find it. The oligarchic party. The complaint among the circles who occupied themselves with thinking and debating, imagine that, was that the democratic state distrusts ability and has a reverence for numbers over knowledge. Athenian thinkers turned against such a state that would distrust ability and revere numbers over knowledge. And they predicted that there would be chaos where there is no thought. They thought it was a base superstition that numbers give wisdom. On the contrary, it is universally seen that men in crowds are more foolish, violent, and cruel than men separate and alone. The thinking was the aristocratic gospel in Athens. It was underground already then because so subversive. Socrates, we know, was the intellectual leader against democracy and for the even then hated aristocratic philosophy. The crowd that shadowed Socrates, young and brilliant, not the Antifa sorts, questioned the specious replacement of the old virtues by unsocial intelligence. And the proof of the foolish, violent, cruel nature of the crowds is that the crowds, not the judges, insisted on making Socrates the first martyr for philosophy. He drank the poison because of the people. No wonder Plato, Socrates as student, had such a scorn for democracy and a hatred for the mob, so extreme that this led this controversial genius to resolve that democracy must be destroyed to be replaced by his planned society, the rule of the wisest and the best, who would have to be discovered and enabled. Of course, to libertarians, Plato of the planned society is wrong, but there is nothing problematic about his insights. His republic is haunted by the fear that democracies eventually degenerate into tyrannies. A democratic utopia of freedom cannot come about because of the nature of man, Plato thought. Men soon tire of what they have, pine for what they have not, and they seldom desire anything unless it belongs to others. The result is the encroachment of one group upon the territory of another. Plato agreed that the diversity of democracy's characters make it look very attractive. However, these citizens are so consumed by pleasure-seeking, so that they beggar the economy, they impoverish it, so hostile to authority that they ignore the advice of sages, and so solipsistic and libertine that they lose any common purpose. Most agreeable to libertarian thinking was Aristotle, who also ventured that democracy on the whole is inferior to aristocracy, for it is based on a false assumption of equality. It arises out of the notion that those who are equal in one respect, under the law, are equal in all respects. Because men are equally free, they claim to be absolutely equal. Tocqueville was certainly not sold on the new American democracy. He conducted his extensive investigation into American life and was prepared to pronounce on what he called the new democracy. Even then, in the 1800s, what menaces democratic society, he found, is the tyranny of mediocrity, a standardization of mind and spirit and condition that emanates from the collectivist disciple. The mass of people will not rest until the state is reorganized to furnish them with material gratification. The American elite, Tocqueville observed, does not form an aristocracy that cherishes individuality, but a bureaucratic elite which exacts rigid conformity, a monotonous equality shared by managers of the society. Tocqueville remarked on the standardization of character in America. He described it as a sort of family likeness that leads to tedium, to boredom, and considered that Tocqueville was writing in relatively smart times. He was a young man who in the 1800s wrote a bestseller, a scholarly work unparalleled. Dr. Tocqueville in the 19th century and Solzhenitsyn in the 20th noted the conformity of thought that is powerfully prevalent in American society. And sadly, Solzhenitsyn was so rejected, a great thinker and a great rebel against authoritarianism. With authoritarianism, he found his way back to Russia. He became so disillusioned. Because it must reach vast majorities, the democratic creed or message tends to simplicity of concept and structure. The tendency in democracy is to reject diversity of thought. Complexity and diversity of thought are difficult to grasp and appreciate, and they cause agitation and cognitive dissonance in a population habituated to the need to feel good all the time. Hence the desperation and the craziness on the Antifa side. In democracy, this impatience with diversity of ideas is elevated into a principle. At the same time that democracies manifest a dislike towards individual difference, they also reflexively strive to eradicate ancient affections and groupings, hence the pushing of the propositional nation. And in case that's not something we're familiar with, a young people probably know Charlie Kirk, a rising social media star, recently he considers himself a populist, but so unfamiliar with first principles are young people these days that he gave a rousing speech. He's very charismatic about how America is an idea, it's not a country. In other words, what he's saying is that America is not a people with a history, with a language, with statutes they want to keep, and with traditions they want to hang on. Not to repeat your blood and soil cry. At the same time, personally I can tell you that writing in the age of the idiot is about, for 20 years now, is about striking the right balance of banality in mediocrity and writing and thinking, which invariably entails echoing one of the two-party lines. And you have to do that poorly, because if you have any flair for language, you immediately cut down to size as well. The impetus or drive of democracy is to sameness, the leveling effect goes against another crucial tenet of ordered liberty and smart civilized life, and that is hierarchy. Hans Hoppe talks a lot about hierarchy. Social hierarchy in our context is ordered liberty, a naturally occurring rank-ordered society in which boundaries are seen as essential to the moral hygiene of a society. But in American democracy, even the distinction between men and women is becoming frowned upon. Never mind between adults and youth, between people of character and those without it, between those who have experience and those who lack it, between equality in intellectual and cultural products, and its absence. There is no getting away from it. Democracy is a leveler. Under the cloud of democracy, Americans no longer applaud a natural hierarchy or spontaneous aristocracy among men such as Thomas Jefferson favored. Under the leveling dictates of democracy, it's impossible to maintain a rank-ordered economy and civil society because that's called discrimination. I'll give you an example. On average, working men put in more hours, on average, accrue more experience in the workplace and enter more lucrative professions. In aggregate, women are more inclined to engage in part-time work, take off time to raise kids, and I was a full-time mum, and choose education over engineering. But when the aggregate of working men is said to earn more than the aggregate of working women, well, that's a national emergency. And an unjust lack of parity is declared, and this becomes a cue for a cruel crusade against men and merit. And you should do a little exercise in your own mind's eye and say to yourself, well, if women were offering for the same skills and the same experience for 70 cents on the dollar, men would have long since priced themselves out of the market. That this hasn't happened shows you the idiocy of the pay gap idea. Undeniably, democracy relies on enforced sameness. Undergirding our public administration is an unyielding ideology upheld by monolithic toadying journalists and pseudo-intellectuals. The ideology is derived from the rickety ideas of social psychology and the enforced public philosophy of pluralism. These have become means through which bureaucrats, educators, and state-approved experts embark on crusades against prejudice and against bourgeoisie or middle-class values like parental authority, the traditional marriage, and the traditional family. The democratic ideology is enforced via a monopoly over the intellectual means of production. The left controls the schools, TV, the print press, the publishing houses, think tanks, except the Mises Institute, the permanent bureaucracy, and of course social media. I'm perennially thrown off social media, and of course I take a good week's break because it's wonderful not to be on this destructive forum, but I've anatomized what happens when they throw you off social media. They immediately, banking on the fact that you are an addict and you want to get back on it, they immediately shake you down for your most intimate details, your mobile, which you must give them nothing, of course. So thankfully, thank God for democratic capitalism, I go out to Target and I buy a burner phone. And that's what they get from me. In any case, the fact that they control the intellectual means of production is even scarier because the left is no longer they don't care about civil liberties, and a once great institution like the ACLU will not defend people with whom they disagree. The new liberal is brain dead, and I quote an old school liberal called John Pilger, a famous and wonderful journalist and one of the few who's fighting for the hero of libertarianism, Julian Assange. And John Pilger put it this way. He said, the new liberal brand amounts to commodified and market-tested diversity. Liberal brains have been pickled in the formaldehyde of identity politics, or even more truthful, in the formaldehyde of anti-white politics. To be fair, the foot soldiers of democracy, left and right, are about manufacturing consent. The consensus percolates across the many ministries of truth, and these make truth-telling a difficult task. In fiction, the Orwellian ministry of truth is a real, reified entity. In reality, there isn't one concrete ministry that decides how the nation thinks, but there are many such entities, and they've evolved over time, and they issue countless subliminal orders. And I will start with an example of a conservative ministry of truth, and that is it used to be conservative. Look at Pete, Booty, Jig. And that's the military ministry. And it sacrifices soldiers and teaches obedient citizenry to parrot the deranged idea that our brave men must fight rural, impoverished people in faraway shithole countries. Thank you, Donald Trump, for that expression, not mine. For my right to stand here and speak freely. Another ministry preaches the monetary gospel already mentioned, that we must be on the rat treadmill, continuously spending and consuming in order to be growing as an economy or to be happy as people. One type of shock treatment used by democracy's many ministries of truth is to call the unhappy deviationist a racist. And I have to remember a cute email that Hans once I had with Hans. I think it was after I was maligned as such by Slate, and on poor grounds, really shoddy writing and shoddy reasoning, and I was feeling sorry of myself when I wrote to Hans Hoppe and said, "No, I'm being called a racist." And he said, "Ilana, if you haven't been called a racist, you're not doing your job." So that's Hans's perspective. So it's a contemporary version of fingering a witch hunt during the Salem witchcraft trials. This treatment awaits any and all who fail to conform to what is considered the correct thinking in our dumbed-down American democracy. Now, we know that mass egalitarian society would degenerate this way. We were warned by the best political thinkers, by America's constitution makers, by Hans Hoppe. And I'd like to quote from a book that he wrote, Democracy, the God That Failed, The Economics and Politics of Monarchy, Democracy, and Natural Order. Hans, of course, is a proponent of natural order. And he said, if forced to choose between the mob, democracy, and monarchy, the latter is far preferable and benevolent. And the thesis, as he anatomized it, and he provided ample support, historical and analytical, for democracy's inferiority as compared to monarchy. And in the main, Hans emphasized that with the destruction of natural elites and the dissolving of great families, the democratic creed also did away with the culture of economic independence, intellectual farsightedness, and moral and spiritual leadership, or what we call noblesse oblige, which is what famous families practiced. Now, rich men, of course, still exist, but more often than not, they owe their wealth to the state, in part or not in full, and they show their appreciation accordingly. America's founding fathers, not that you would know this, certainly attempted to forestall a raw democracy and devise a republic. Constitutional scholar James McClellan, a man of the South, I believe, noted that the universal suffrage and mass democracy were alien to our founders. Now, would you know that from popular discourse? No. They believed that democracy would tend towards mediocrity and tyranny of the majority. Writing about the first state constitutions between 1776 and 1783, McClellan notes that a complete democracy on a wide scale was widely regarded throughout the colonies as a threat to law and order. Pennsylvania actually became the laughingstock when it abolished all property qualifications for voting and holding office. This confirmed the suspicions of many colonial leaders that an unrestrained democracy could drive out good men out of public office and turn the affairs of state over to pettifoggers, bunglers, and demagogues. Pettifoggers, lousy lawyers. The founders wanted representation of brains, not bodies. And for the number of years, the best minds in the country dominated American politics. A particularly grotesque and recent example of what I call democratic leveling was provided by Bernie Sanders. He said that everyone should have the vote, even the Boston Marathon bomber, even the most terrible people. Now think about it, people whose vocation is killing their countrymen should have a lien on those countrymen's property. This is not insignificant. As it stands, there are almost no moral, ethical, or intellectual requirements attached to citizenship in our near unfettered democracy. In democracy, everyone must have access to everything all the time. Hence concepts like the wealth gap, the pay gap, and other I want what you have gaps. As a global democracy, the world must be able to wash up on America's shores and be kept in style. Related to this concept and to the upcoming election is that democracy brings about a dominant party state. Not only does it have a leveling effect, but it brings about this dominant party state. How does that happen? Thumping majorities demand stuff. The political party that gives the majorities the most stuff gets their support. Thus, inherent in democracy, and you'll see it reflected in positions, even on the populist side, during the 2020 charade, is a convergence of the political state and the further closing of the American mind. This is why intelligence and moral character in a polity cannot be overstated. And once again, you can see that my age betrays my affinities. British Prime Minister George Canning, he died in 1827, said that the franchise should be accorded to persons and classes insofar as they possess the qualifications for right judgment. To the extent an individual citizen is a decent member of the community, said gentlemen of his era, he may be a candidate for the vote. And of course, they did not have the issue of mass migration in those days. The 1800s are replete with stellar thinkers who predicted the continual degradation of the suffrage through mass franchise and that it would end in a new despotism and in a lot of dumbness. So the radical Mr. Sanders is quite correct. If we consider democracy's historical trajectory as presaged by many wise men, it is true that democracy must be perpetually expanded, and every single person must be seen as having the right to vote, irrespective of circumstance and character. And the vote, again, is a lien on someone else's property and life. Since in democracy there is no sifting the wheat from the chaff, democracy is by its nature radical. In Mr. Canning's day, like today, radical rising egalitarians who championed the universal vote, they attacked institution after institution. That's familiar, isn't it? They harbored systematic hostility towards owners of landed property and private property, and they insisted that representative institutions and the franchise be extended to everybody irrespective of circumstance and character. I mentioned the pettifoggers, bunglers, and demagogues, whom colonial leaders feared would rise in a democracy, and I want to talk just briefly about the pettifoggers, namely the lousy lawyers. It's important to talk law because in the context of our democratic idiocracy, we live under the law of rule, not the rule of law. And I think, Jeff, I'm correct in saying that most cases that move through our courts are based on this show of force that is the plea bargain, isn't it? The state mounts an insurmountable case against the single individual using its bottomless resources, and the individual has to cop a plea. Now, a defense attorney, whether he's defending Jeffrey Dahmer or anybody else, has to mount a vigorous defense for his client, but the role of the prosecutor is a search for truth. Therefore, you can see how the legal system has become such a travesty when it is actually based on the plea bargain, a kneecapping of sorts, right? But first, law is complicated, and to practice it properly, it is essential to have the ability to reason at a certain level of abstraction, because what you are doing, you are applying abstract principles to reality. And in this practice, I include judges and juries. Yet most law schools in the US practice affirmative action. In academia, law schools have lowered the bar in admissions and on the bar exam. Universities run a dual admission process, one admission pool for white applicants and increasingly Asians, and a far less competitive one for minorities. And related, and particularly terrifying, is the democratic demagogic mob mindset that is coming to animate legal rulings. One dare not write openly these days about matters of law because both factions, left and right, cheer on mob injustice and unfathomable cruelty. Anybody even mention Assange and what is being done to him? So whether on TV panels, on the bench, or in the jury box, the people who sit in judgment of others these days increasingly don't always grasp the basic concepts of due process, the rules of evidence, and what profound values these constitute. By way of an example, and quickly, I'll do this quickly, we have the Me Too movementarians who now make law. In the case of Bill Cosby, we witnessed a persecution by a merciless matriarchy that further is feminizing and debasing US law. This is where the Me Too movement is headed and has led us. A revenge prosecution based on hearsay evidence from women who act and sound demented, and there are many cases like this. In previous eras, hysterics would have been disqualified as witnesses. Now, some of the Cosby case facts may be true, maybe all of the facts are true. However, they can't possibly meet the rules of evidence, the ones we once cherished. They can't possibly be corroborated for the purpose of a just prosecution and in accordance with legal standards of Western law of blessed memory. The quality of evidence against Bill Cosby, and this is just one amongst many examples, is he said, she said. Now that's the law dumbed down and democratized to suit the democratic swell that is the social justice movement of the day. It's dangerous. Let's talk educational democracy and how it kills meritocracy. The world in which we live equally distributes talent. It does not equally distribute opportunity. So declared an idiot ad. I told you I'll be saying idiot a lot. So, allow me. So declared an idiot ad for an online universities, and those are lies. Of course, talent is unequally distributed. Nevertheless, this belief system accounts for why the idea in democracy is that everyone must have access to everything, to put it hyperbolically, and why in democracy people are educated beyond their intelligence, to use Russell Kirk's delicious expression. The practice of quotas, set-asides, and affirmative action is educational democracy. The idea is to have democratic, proportional representation in pigment and gender in every field of endeavor, so that if women make up 51% of the population, we're more numerous, I think, then they should be represented to the tune of 50%, let's say, in the field of physics or engineering. My engineer friends, how likely is that? What is the reason behind such dumbness-causing educational leveling? Well, from the fact that African Americans lag behind whites and Asians in academic and socioeconomic achievements, the prevalence of deep-seated racism is inferred. This logical error of backward reasoning, if B then A, is the central tenet of affirmative action. Of course, we never reason that from the fact that whites lag Asians in socioeconomic achievements, that there is a systemic anti-white bias. We never reason that way. So we're very selective. According to the democratic doxology, the prevailing opinion, justice is achieved only when racial and ethnic groups are reflected in academia and in the professions in proportion to their presence in the larger population. And this is impossible considering age-old individual and intergroup differences. Many undergraduate institutions and most law schools and medical schools in the US practice affirmative action. The problem of affirmative action, we libertarians like to point out, are the peculiar province of state-controlled schools. In a free market for education, schools would be able to establish any admission criteria they like. I mean, if a school wants to admit, let's say, African American albinos only, well, that's the prerogative of private property, right? But there is a private sector idiocracy. A private sector idiocracy exists. Increasingly, we see private institutions and certainly gargantuan businesses like the high-tech multinationals engage in vigorous virtue signaling of affirmative action. And how can this be? Well, the American democracy creates a powerful pull, a consensus that percolates throughout, and business is not immune. Certain narratives soon come to dominate the democratic marketplace of ideas to the exclusion of competing narratives. The narrative of social justice in society is one example. And like any successful monopoly, the monopoly over cultural discourse is won through government privilege. In partnership with government, opinion enforcers, and certainly in the high-tech industry, get to decide who is on the side of the angels and who will burn in hell. And there is no question that, like government, the high-tech companies uphold the tyrannical ideological edifice erected to perpetuate one myth, for example, that in aggregate, women and men are identical in aptitude and in interests, and that all disparities in representation are due to systemic oppression. So entire human resource departments in the high-tech sector are dedicated to recruiting, mentoring, and just plain dealing with women and their ongoing nagging and special needs. I'm allowed to say that? I'm a woman. I nag. Minorities are also at a premium. The difference is that big business runs on the profit motive, and thus it has to be smart enough to build into its systems enough redundancy to compensate for dumb political posturing. But of course, some people, men and women deserving, do double duty. In any event, when the best person for the job ethos gives way to racial and gender window dressing and to the enforcement of politically pleasing perspectives, things start to fall apart. Again, it's not only American public institutions which continue to subordinate their raison d'etre, whatever it is, to politically dictated equality of outcomes. As I said, it's the private realm. And this is why the darkness of dumbness is, I love saying dumbness, is descending. Increasingly, in our democracy, merit is framed as racist. The slumdog elites of our American idiocracy are moving to equate merit-based institutions with institutionalized racism. The idea of merit, like anything else in our society, is being framed in racial terms. And for example, Secretary Ryan Zinke was outed in disgrace by the CNN Politburo after he was overheard by a thought police plant, no doubt, expressing a preference for merit-based recruits for his department. Oh my God, this was a day on CNN. The poor man. So to frame merit as tainted by systemic racism is not only devious, but it's dumb and destructive, because as individuals, we all want the best doctors operating on us and treating us. We all want the best pilots flying the aeroplanes we board. We all want the best engineers designing the bridges we cross, the best scientists inventing and bringing to market the medicines and potions we ingest. Merit, however, will always be a racist concept to an egalitarian, to a progressive. And why is that? That is because by conceding merit, one is admitting that some may have more or less of a certain desired quality than others. Some may have more moral and intellectual merit than others. And However, in our defense of a smart, merit-based society, we libertarians must guard against another logical error. So while it is true that the free market doesn't discriminate, and it's the best route to a merit-based smart society, and it is true that rational self-interest of individuals in private enterprise is always not to discriminate. But rational self-interest, of course, does indeed propel people, however prejudiced, to set aside bias and put their scarce resources to the best use. But to simply state that discrimination is bad for business is to present an incomplete picture of reality. The market is biased towards productivity. Hiring people on the basis of criteria other than productivity hurts the proprietor's pocket, the bottom line. And so we can be fairly certain that absent democratic, racist affirmative action laws, the market would reflect a bias towards productivity. And that is a very discriminating preference indeed, isn't it? Consequently, a truly free market is always a market in which groups and individuals are undemocratically and differently represented. And this reality is unacceptable to democratic socialists. To them, lack of parity in prosperity and performance between differently able individuals and groups signals undemocratic oppression, and it must be always greeted with the actions of the socialist leveler. So the best antidote to the dumbness and coerciveness of social democracy is, as Hans-Hermann Hoppe says, absolute private property. And this will do the trick. Private property, unregulated, will solve the problem of differently able individuals by allowing everyone to associate and dissociate, hire, fire, and rent to at will. I want to discuss democracy and state force. Scholars always and everywhere, scholars of democracy, describe a good democracy as one which is commensurate with class, wealth, and occupational convergence, sameness. The pointy heads are forever lamenting that a less than perfect democracy has been achieved when women and minorities have failed, and other victims have failed to achieve economic equality. Since natural inequalities are part of the human condition, egalitarianism requires concerted act of government force. So democracy, a creature of little brains, requires considerable brawn to enforce. Democracy is therefore optimized in spheres where the state is most active. Democratic social structure is a product of the systematic use of political power. And inasmuch as democracy's aim is the achievement of equality, it goes against liberty and meritocracy, of course. Now, my favorite, well, being cynical, is to talk about our shared democratic values. You'll hear the 2020 candidates wax fat about our shared values. Senator Kamala Harris especially talks a lot about our American values being under attack. Don't listen. And not because values are unimportant, but because in democracy, so-called shared values are a cudgel, a weapon of control. The idea of self-government and not imposed government implies that society, not the state, is to develop value systems from the ground up. And through an appeal to values, the state aggrandizes itself, but more than that, it controls us. And to effectively control hundreds of millions of disgruntled, disunited, different Americans, values are enforced by the idiot elite's control of the means of intellectual production already mentioned. And to catch on, democratic values must be simple and jingoistic, in other words, rah-rah type values. I mentioned the militarist mantra about my owing my freedom to stand here and to speak to you, to our poor soldiers who must kill and get killed in shithole countries. Also mentioned was the mindless monetary mantra. Another is when the idiot elites want to shame ordinary Americans about their absolute right to stop the world from invading their communities. Then the idiot elites say, This is not who we are from behind the gated communities in rarefied zip codes. So democracy is guided by manufactured, devalued, incoherent values, which is another layer of dumb for you. But it's also dangerous because, as the big dog of democracies, the US is the most powerful entity in the world. As represented by the US government, our global democracy gets to manufacture its own grand narrative, its own parallel universe. If you remember Homer Simpson when he entered the parallel universe, we manufacture our own parallel universe with its unique rules of evidence and standards of proof. What's more, as the mightiest rule maker in the universe, America can coerce other earthlings into sharing that alternate reality or else. So to comprehend the mass hysteria, as my colleagues alluded to, the hysteria around Trump, to comprehend that hysteria, the hysteria that is the war on Trump, it's essential to trace the contours of that other war to spread democracy. It was called Operation Iraqi Freedom, and the way it was peddled to the American public. The manufacturing of fake news by the deep state in 2017 shares the absolute same dynamic with the anatomy of the ramp-up to war in Iraq circa 2003. To manufacture democratic consent regarding the Russia monomania and Iraq respectively, elements in the intelligence community and permanent bureaucracy, and this is not, the deep state is not a revolutionary concept. James Burnham, okay, I'll hurry up. James Burnham referred to it, etc., etc. Anyhow, they worked with people, with front people in the neoconservative counterparts in both administrations, Trump and Bush. Conscripted into America's manufactured reality, Iraqis paid the price of this terrible American concoction, this grand, ghoulish American narrative. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqis were displaced and killed due to the grand global narrative that was Operation Iraqi Freedom. And Karl Rove, actually, one of those enduring political cockroaches of our time, still going strong despite being wrong on almost everything. At the time, he was so cognizant of the evil that he was doing that he gave an interview anon to the main press, and he said, in the ramp-up to the war in Iraq, he said, "We are an empire and we create our own reality." The same frenzy of inflamed, foolish imaginations emanates from the deep state and agitates against Trump, and it could very well have spilled over into all-out war against Russia. It was touch and go there, Iran, or North Korea. As you can see, American democracy, domestic and global, is as dangerous as it is dumb. And I conclude, have I got time to conclude quickly? Very quickly, on a positive note, a happy note, by refuting one of the epic errors Dinesh D'Souza makes. D'Souza is a neoconservative pundit, and he's forever vaporizing and noodling on about America being a categorically good country, not a bad country. D'Souza accuses liberals of bad-mouthing elements of American history. He usually pairs his case for a categorically good America with whitewashing the ethnic cleansing of our First Nations, our Amerindians. In this, D'Souza is a tool of the Ministry of Truth mentioned. More importantly, D'Souza's argument is dumb. It is a confusion of category, really, and it is good news for us. Why so? D'Souza routinely collapses the distinction between America and the US government. America is not the same as the US government. It's possible to disavow and label as wicked every single action taken by the US government and still love the little platoons of America, our families, our friends, our neighbors, our co-religionists, our co-workers, and you guys. Healthy patriotism is associated with robust particularism, petty provincialism, if you want. In other words, love the locality, and to hell with a democratic political dispensation. So, to end, the system of American democracy is dumb but there is a lot to love about very many individual Americans who labor under that system. Thank you.